vocational rehabilitation setting, which falls under social services. So I chose this particular observation for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was unique as in the deaf clients were the ones in authority or the ones giving advice rather than the other way around. Oftentimes in my own work in the community, as well as during my observations, the professional in the setting, the doctor, the counselor, or what have you, is usually the hearing person, and the deaf person is the one coming to seek services, which obviously means that the power dynamic is in the favor of the hearing individual. However, in this case, both of the vocational rehabilitation counselors that I saw working were deaf. One of them had 10 years of experience working with the agency, and the other had about 7 months. The one who had about 10 years of experience was Caucasian, about in his 50s, and very familiar with the interpreter. The newest team member was a woman who was about 30 years old, who was also Caucasian, and had been working with the interpreter for as long as she had been working with the agency. The interpreter that I had the privilege of observing was also Caucasian, was a woman, and had about 25 years of experience working in vocational rehabilitation collectively. She had been working with both clients for as long as they had been with the agency. Now, in terms of the environment, one of the challenges or demands that I encountered immediately was the vocabulary. So as in any subfield or field, they had their own terms that they use with other counselors or with their clients on occasion, such as IDP or caseload or VRC, which means Vocational Rehabilitation Counselor, or DARS, which is the Department of Assistive and Rehabilitative Services in Texas. So all of these terms were being thrown around, and some of them I was familiar with, some of them not so much. But the interpreter was familiar with all of them and was able to convey the meaning, expanding if appropriate. So if she was, in my conversation with her afterwards, we discussed this, and she mentioned that if there was another counselor addressing the deaf counselor, then she would of course not need to provide any expansion. Whereas if there were a client addressing the deaf counselor, she might need to expand a little or anticipate that the deaf counselor would expand a little. She herself had many years of experience in the setting and was able to convey the meaning appropriately depending on the situation. Now, in terms of the setup of the room, the client was behind an L-shaped desk, part of which faced the wall and then part of which was what she used as kind of a consultation desk over which she saw her clients. So essentially this is what the setup of the room looked like. And then the deaf counselor would sit behind the desk like this. So anyway, that was the basic setup of the room. The side of the desk facing the wall had a telephone and a computer on it. And then the counselor would sit on this side and the client would sit on this side. Something that I saw the interpreter do during the actual meeting with the clients, that is to say the clients of the counselor, was that she would sit behind the hearing client who was sitting here, so she would be able to maintain sight lines with the deaf counselor, and at the same time the deaf counselor would maintain direct sight lines with the hearing client who is sitting right across the desk from her, and the hearing client was able to maintain sight lines with the deaf client without having an interpreter to interrupt that sight line or that kind of direct access to her body language and so that they could have access to the eye gaze of one another and be able to interact in a more natural way. Another option would have been for the interpreter to sit alongside the desk, but that would have meant that the deaf client would have to direct her eye gaze to the interpreter on a regular basis during the encounter, and she would have broken eye contact with the deaf client. So ultimately, the interpreter's control choice was more effective. As I mentioned, there was a phone and a computer on the side facing the wall. So the phone and the computer were positioned here and here. And the interpreter ordinarily sat here. It was interesting because in this case, the phone actually was not a video phone, which is something that I anticipated coming in, assuming that, well, of course, they're deaf professionals, so of course they probably have video phones. Well, the counselor who had been working with the agency for 10 years did have a video phone, but the other counselor who had just joined 7 months ago did not have access to a video phone and just had a regular voice phone on her desk. So they had asked the interpreter to actually interpret the conversations that she had on the phone as well as the messages on the answering machine, which became quite interesting, as I'll go into later, in the interpersonal demands in terms of turn taking and silences and all sorts of other factors. It also is interesting in terms of listening to the answering machine messages, as sometimes the sound quality was not entirely clear. But I'll get into that later when I discuss the paralinguistic demands. So another interesting environmental demand, if you will, was the use of phone trees as kind of a part of the fact that she was using a voice phone. So when they encountered these phone trees, rather than interpret all of the options, the interpreter would actually simply tell the client which option to press. Instead of saying, you know, for this press option 1, for this press option 2, for this press option 3. The positive consequence was that the deaf client was able to know which number to press and to be transferred to the appropriate party in a very time-efficient manner. The only negative consequence was that she was not given access to the actual content of the message and then able to make that decision on her own based off of what she needed. Interestingly enough, when I spoke to the interpreter afterwards, she mentioned that she used a different control choice when she interpreted for video relay service because the clients were not familiar with her and because they did not have that kind of rapport of trust with her. She had not ever met them before, so she would simply give them the options and then allow them to choose. In this case, though, the deaf client was only using the regular phone on a temporary basis, and in addition, the interpreter was physically there with her, just not right close to her. So if the interpreter had chosen instead to interpret all the phone tree options, she would have to look from the interpreter to her phone to make the correct selection. And one of the resulting demands potentially would be that she would be disconnected from the phone tree before she was able to make that selection and process the call. So this is definitely more effective control choice on the part of the interpreter. Something else I saw the interpreter do as a result of interpreting phone conversations was to kind of add introductions or other pieces of information. But again, I'll get more into that when I speak of the interpersonal demands. Something that I thought was interesting in all of this was that the interpreter had to consider the goal of the environment, which was to grant clients those services they needed to either continue with work or to find work through her control choices. So sometimes she would use more liberal control choices to maintain that relationship between the deaf counselor and her clients, as opposed to using more conservative control choices and risking perhaps a disconnection or dissatisfaction with the service. Now, in terms of interpersonal demands, obviously the deaf client was the one in authority, and the interpreter sometimes would step in and sometimes would simply interpret depending on the need. So when the deaf client left her office, the hearing interpreter went along with her and simply stepped out in the hallway. The positive consequence was that the deaf client or the deaf counselor, was aware of everything that the hearing interpreter said to the hearing client, and there was nothing that she was unaware of transpiring between the interpreter and the hearing client. The only negative consequence was that the hearing client was unable to ask the interpreter about the interpreting process or any other relevant questions he might have. When I spoke with the interpreter afterwards, she mentioned that ordinarily the conversations that clients might have with her if she does stay in the office are very, very surface level or asking about the interpreting process and entirely appropriate. But there are times when they wish to ask more in-depth questions of the interpreter, which should be referred to the counselor. In addition, if she does stay in the room, she risks perhaps losing that trust with the counselor who would not know what she was speaking about with the hearing client in the room. And this was something that was very, very important to her, was maintaining that rapport of trust. Because when she interacted with clients via distance, like through the phone, sometimes the deaf client would be typing an email and the interpreter would choose to use more liberal control choices, such as conversing with the hearing client on the other end of the phone about what the deaf client was typing in the emails. Like she might say, remember to go to this address, or at this time, or at this date, or just fill in some of those other details that the deaf client was typing in the email, but without saying she is typing this. Instead, she would converse with the hearing client and answer any questions that he had if he had not heard something clearly. One of the positive consequences was that the hearing client would be given access to the information on the screen, as well as given a message that they could feel comfortable with instead of a long period of silence. The only negative consequence was that they were not given access to what exactly that deaf client was signing or not signing in this case. Interestingly enough, when I spoke with the interpreter afterwards, she mentioned that there were several factors that allowed her to make this more liberal control choice that she would not have had in video relay service, where she also works on occasion. She mentioned that, first of all, the deaf client has trust in her, so she trusts her not to say extraneous things or to speak about the deaf client while she is conversing with the hearing client. She trusted her instead to convey whatever she felt was necessary to make that hearing client feel comfortable. If she had chosen instead to simply say she is typing an email, she would have, first of all, let the client know immediately that the counselor was deaf, which is something the counselor may not have wanted that client to know at that time. And also, she would have then subsequently left the client in a period of silence, causing the client potentially to feel uncomfortable as a resulting demand, perhaps saying hello, hello, or simply hanging up, which are both resulting demands that have happened in the past when she has chosen to use this more conservative control choice. Something else that occurred as an interpersonal demand was that sometimes there was overlap in turn taking. So, for example, sometimes the deaf counselor would begin signing and then the hearing client would interrupt, or perhaps the hearing client would be saying something and the interpreter would be interpreting, and then subsequently the counselor would interrupt and say something. The interpreter used different control choices, all of which were effective, depending on the situation and depending on a number of factors. So first of all, sometimes the interpreter chose simply to immediately begin voicing when the deaf client began signing and to interrupt the hearing consumer who was speaking. The positive consequence was that the deaf counselor, who was the one in authority, was given the floor more speedily, and the negative consequence was that the hearing client was interrupted and the rest of whatever he was saying was not conveyed. At other times, the interpreter would continue to interpret what the hearing client was saying and then begin listening to the deaf client visually at the same time and retain whatever she was signing. And after that point, once the hearing client stopped signing, or stopped speaking, she would begin to voice whatever the deaf client had said. The positive consequence in this case was that the hearing client was allowed to continue without interruption for a brief time and was able to finish his thought. And the negative consequence was that the deaf client was not given the floor immediately. Ultimately, usually the resulting demand was that the hearing client would note that the deaf client was getting ready to say something by the way she was signing and would, after a short period of time, finish his thought and allow the deaf counselor to take the floor at any rate. Another interesting interpersonal demand that occurred was that the deaf client used her voice, and sometimes the hearing client wasn't able to understand that voice. So the interpreter again used a number of different control choices. Sometimes she would simply allow the clients to discover on their own that the communication was not being effective, and at other times she would actually step in, interrupt, and mention that the communication was not effective. She might say something like, "I'm not sure if you understood that," or something of that nature. So in the case of the first control choice, where she would simply allow them to ascertain on their own that communication was not working for whatever reason, that the deaf client was not being understood by the hearing client, the positive consequence was that the clients were able to discover it on their own without intervention from the interpreter, and the negative consequence was the time that it took for them to discover that, which would be longer than it had the interpreter interrupted and mentioned that the communication was not as effective as it could be. In the second case, the interpreter jumping in, the positive consequence was that the clients were given the awareness more rapidly that communication was not as effective as it could be. And the negative consequence was that they were not able to ascertain that on their own and then work toward a solution on their own. In both cases, whether the clients were told or whether the interpreter jumped in, oftentimes the deaf counselor would either begin signing as a resulting demand, or she would look to the interpreter to revoice what she had just signed, and the interpreter would then follow suit. Obviously, if the deaf client began signing, then the interpreter would voice interpret. And if the deaf counselor looked to her to begin voicing or revoicing what she had said, she would sometimes add expansions or word it in a different way until the deaf or the hearing client was able to understand clearly. And again, because of that rapport of trust that she had working with this counselor for 7 months, she was able to do things like that without causing offense or appearing to be taking over the counselor's job. And ordinarily, as a resulting demand, or as a resolution rather, the hearing client would nod when he understood, and then the interaction would proceed as normal. In terms of turn taking and everything that was going on as well, I did want to mention briefly that sometimes when the hearing and the deaf client were conversing and they were back channeling signals, sometimes the interpreter would interpret those and sometimes she would not. And I noticed that sometimes the back channeling signals would be a single word like "oh," or sometimes it would be a string of words to show understanding. Both clients could see each other and could see that they were understanding one another, so really that information did not need to be conveyed. When the interpreter chose not to convey those back channeling signals, the positive consequence was that whoever was speaking or signing was able to continue uninterrupted, and the only negative consequence was that that person was not given access to the exact wording of those back channeling signals. I would consider both the control choice of interpreting those back channeling signals and of not interpreting those back channeling signals to be effective depending on the situation, as they both allowed the conversation to proceed and both clients to continue to understand one another and the points that they were making. In the case of choosing to voice those back channeling signals, the negative consequence would be that the clients would be temporarily interrupted, and the positive consequence would be that they would be given access to the information in that back channeling signal as it was conveyed. In terms of paralinguistic demands, there was a very interesting paralinguistic demand, as I mentioned earlier, because of the nature of the voice phone being used. So as we know, sometimes phone conversations are not perfect. Sometimes there's static, sometimes the voice quality is not what we would desire it to be. And so we have to make adaptations even as hearing people using the phone. Well, in this case, the deaf client was using a phone through the interpreter. Ordinarily, the hearing interpreter would bring some kind of a headset similar to what she used in VRS to respond to this demand of the static or the unclear voice quality, as it allowed her to connect more directly to the phone and improve the voice quality as a result. However, on this particular day, for some strange reason, the headset that she used was not working. So besides trying to fix it as in post-assignment control, she chose on this particular occasion to continue to use the phone on speakerphone. And this allowed her to be at a comfortable distance from the deaf client, while at the same time being able to hear the message. The only negative consequence was that, again, the quality of that message was not what it could be had she chosen to use the phone and hold it to her ear. However, had she chosen to use the phone, she would have had to face the negative consequence of needing to be closer, maybe uncomfortably close to the deaf client and in her personal space. Although the positive consequence would be greater sound quality. She would also have to deal with the additional demand of how to hold the phone, so perhaps holding it against her ear while interpreting, which probably would have not been the most effective option. Whenever there was static to the point that either she was unable to understand the hearing client or the hearing client wasn't able to understand her, she would respond accordingly. If it was her that wasn't able to hear the hearing client, she would ask for repetition as if she were the counselor. She never mentioned that there was an interpreter making the call. And if it was the case that the client could not hear her, she would simply repeat it, maybe in different words, and then ask to ensure that she had been heard. And this seemed to be very effective. In terms of intrapersonal demands, there did not seem to be any significant interpersonal demands. The interpreter did not convey any doubt or hesitation during the assignment. She seemed to be well versed in the vocabulary. There was one point when the client was mentioning, when the hearing client, that is to say, was mentioning some accomplishment in his life. I believe it was how many years he had been married or something of that nature. And the interpreter was impressed. She said something like, wow, but then she went on with interpreting, so it did not become a significant interruption to the message. In this case, since she had met with the deaf client before, was very familiar with her, as well as had briefly spoke with the hearing client before and was familiar with him, the simple voicing of wow did not significantly impact the communication dynamics or anything of that nature. Had I been in that situation, I might have experienced some interpersonal demands, such as wondering what the terms meant, not feeling confident I could convey them correctly. I may have made some errors. I may have expressed some lack of confidence as a result of the speed at which the deaf client signed. But in this case, the interpreter was very familiar with the terminology and with the client signing style and expressed none of those concerns. In my conversations with the interpreter afterwards, I felt that I was enlightened in a number of ways. So I spoke with her about the more liberal control choices that she had used in terms of interpreting for the phone tree and adding those extra bits of conversation as the hearing client was listening to the deaf client over the phone. And what she told me about was the difference it makes in knowing someone personally or knowing someone in person and working with them on a regular basis and working with a client on an occasional or one-time basis, as well as working with any random deaf person over the phone. So when I asked her, how do you know when to just interpret and when to take a more active role in the exchange, she mentioned that she had had those conversations with those deaf counselors as a pre-assignment control, and she had built up that rapport of trust with them over the years or over the months that she had been working with them, and thus was able to effectively know when it was appropriate to take the extra step and add that extra piece of conversation in order to maintain the relationship and to avoid being hung up on because of that. When I asked her about her knowledge of the relevant terminology and how long she had been working in there, she told me she had been working there for several years, 25 years, and with each of these counselors for as long as they had been working for the agency. When I asked her why she chose to interpret the phone calls rather than just relying on VRS to interpret the calls of the deaf clients, she did mention that occasionally the newest deaf counselor did go into the office of the counselor who had been there for 10 years to use his video phone, but that also often both of the counselors depended on her to interpret their phone calls if it was of high consequence, because they trusted her and because she knew the vocabulary, whereas an ordinary VRS interpreter might or might not know the vocabulary and might or might not make mistakes. Also, the VRS interpreters, as a result of not having worked necessarily with a deaf client, with that deaf counselor, would be hesitant to take more liberal control choices, such as voicing what she was typing in the email or adding the extra bit of conversation to avoid long periods of silence. Another aspect was that the video relay service interpreter was in a different space physically than the deaf counselor and would be unable to see whatever the deaf client was typing on her computer, and thus be unable even to give the extra information to whoever was calling. So a couple of lessons that I learned from this particular observation were, first of all, that it really depends on the situation, the clients, and really everything else to determine whether we make more liberal or more conservative control choices. Some of the control choices that I never would have considered making because I would have been hesitant as a newer interpreter were perfectly appropriate and even probably the most effective control choice in this setting because the interpreter was aware of and was familiar with the clients. So she was able to add those extra pieces of conversation, such as, please meet me at this place at this time, and even answering the questions that the clients had about the information given if they had misunderstood, as the deaf client was typing emails, whereas a regular VRS interpreter certainly would not have felt comfortable with doing that. Also, I learned from this encounter that the control choices we bring to an assignment really depend on not only how much research we did or anything of that nature, or not even just our personality and the ability we have to connect with clients. It also depends a great deal on our former working experience as interpreters. And I began to really reflect on that because whatever experience I have in the interpreting field has helped me to be able to interpret subsequent appointments of the same nature more effectively. So for instance, if I interpret an assignment where the concept of a coloscopy is mentioned and I have to look up the term afterwards because I'm not sure what that means, or I have to ask the doctor for clarification, on subsequent assignments when that term is mentioned, I will be completely ready with classifiers, expansions, and everything else needed. In this case, the interpreter had been working in vocational rehabilitation for years and had no need to research any relevant terminology that I might have to if I were in her shoes. Instead, she was able to just bring that cumulative experience with her every time she interpreted in this setting and was able to render an effective interpretation as a result. Something that I reflected on was how each interpreter brings something different to the plate, and that we need to know ourselves well in order to know which assignments are a good fit for us and how much we need to do in preparation and anticipation for that assignment. So something I would like to leave you with are a couple of questions. First of all, how do we know if we are empowering or disempowering the client by making more liberal or conservative control choices? And second of all, how can we build that rapport of trust with the client so that they feel comfortable with us making those more liberal control choices? Something that the interpreter mentioned to me during our post-assignment conference was that it's not necessarily the more conservative control choices that leave the deaf client more empowered. So whereas certainly if it were a doctor's office appointment and the doctor were to ask the interpreter a question and the interpreter were to respond instead of directing it to the deaf client, that would be inappropriately liberal. However, in the case of the deaf counselor, not adding those little bits of information that she was not in fact signing and conversing with the client about what she was typing in the email was actually more empowering to her because it allowed the hearing client to hear a message that he or she felt was natural, and then they were able to know what was going on as well. Whereas leaving that client in silence would leave them maybe with the impression that the counselor was ignoring them or would cause them to feel a great deal of discomfort and perhaps disconnect from that counselor, which would be thereby definitely not empowering her. In the same way, simply interpreting every option on the phone tree and then forcing the deaf client to look down at her phone and to choose the appropriate option might have caused her to be disconnected from the phone tree, thereby causing more frustration than empowerment. So these are just a couple of questions I would like to leave you with. I look forward to watching your presentations, and I look forward to your opinion about this presentation. Thank you.